Dobrodošli u podcast Progovorimo, serijal razgovora koji otvara prostor za najvažnije, često prešućene teme. Vodimo razgovore koji mijenjaju stavove, ruše tabue i pružaju podršku. Serijal je dio šire kampanje Progovorimo u okviru projekta OSNAŽI JE koji implementira Fondacija lokalne demokratije u partnerstvu sa Agencijom za ravnopravnost spolova Bosne i Hercegovine i sigurnom mrežom, a financijski podržava UN Trust fond. Fondacija lokalne demokracije s više od 28 godina iskustva predvodnik je pozitivnih društvenih promjena u Bosni i Hercegovini. Ova organizacija posvećena je zaštiti ljudskih prava, posebno prava žena, kroz zakonske reforme, edukaciju i servise podrške, sigurnu kuću, SOS telefon za žrtve nasilja, centar za žene koji pruža besplatnu pravnu, psihološku i socioekonomsku podršku. U ovom podcastu razgovaram sa predstavnicom UN Women kancelarije u Bosni i Hercegovini, Jan Bishop, koja ima više od 20 godina međunarodnog iskustva, uključujući više rukovodstvo u Ujedinjenim nacijama, organizaciji za evropsku sigurnost i suradnju, te vladinim i nevladinim institucijama u brojnim zemljama. Jan, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
You have over 20 years of experience in international organizations, including the UN and OSCE. How did your journey start, and what brought you to your current role at UN Women?
Thank you so much. So actually, it's very interesting because my international journey started here in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I remember very well...
In 1995?
In 1999. 1999. And I remember the moment I arrived, and it was such an incredible period for me and moment of reflection now being here also so many years later. At that point in time, there was so much hope. It was incredible to see the resilience, the aspirations of people in this country to rebuild, to recover. But I also saw firsthand the leadership that women were also playing on the international stage, fresh from war, fresh from trauma, really trying to push international changes. And that inspired me, and it left a mark. And my first international experience here has really shaped the rest of my career in so many ways. I was very inspired. After that, I went on, I worked in many different countries and did a range of different things, working with government, gender equality institutions in Timor-Leste, working with human rights defenders in Afghanistan, working in peacekeeping. So my career started here, but it started much earlier. When I look back, and all women, we know the statistics, but all women have either experienced or have been affected firsthand by violence. And when I look back at my early years, there was two moments that really influenced me and inspired me to work in human rights and gender equality. One was when I was young. I was in high school, and we had a student come and talk to us from Chile. And she was speaking out against the Pinochet regime. She was a defender of human rights. She was out in the streets protesting for freedom of expression. Her body was set aflame. She survived. And after that experience, she traveled to raise awareness about the importance of fundamental human rights. That really moved me deeply. And at that moment, I decided that this was really where I wanted to invest efforts and be this effort to be committed to for the rest of my life. Also, when I went to university and I was studying human rights, international affairs, I remember being at university, and at that point, and this is in Canada, there were cases of sexual violence, of rape on our campus. And during that time, I've always been an activist. I've always felt that being part of the change is important. And at that point, I was very involved in setting up the first sexual assault center for the city of Edmonton, where I was studying, but also in setting up a Safe Walk program, because many women, but also some men, did not feel safe walking alone after hours on campus because of things that were happening. So we set up a program where women could be, or men could be, accompanied by women and men to walk them home safely. So I experienced, like so many women and men, girls and boys have experienced, that sense of lack of safety, directly affected by different forms of violence or threats of violence. So this has really, these moments in my youth really shaped me in my career to do what I'm doing today.
You have mentioned being a mother of 2 feminist children. How do you think we can inspire young people to fight for gender equality?
Well, it's a very challenging moment right now,
Yes.
because we know, and this year is really critical. It's a landmark year for women's rights and gender equality. We have 30 years marking the anniversary of the first conference of women and the landmark declaration for women's rights. At the same time, we know the big figure, which is 136 years to close the global gender equality gap. We see pushbacks on gender equality, on women's rights, even on the notion of the term gender. So it's more important than ever to show why gender equality is critical, why it's important for our economies, why it's important for our well-being as a society, for our development. And I think young people, they really are the ones that are going to make the difference. There was a recent survey by Plan International, and even in this bleak context, 75% of young people felt that gender equality was possible within their lifetime. We have the Sustainable Development Goals. We know that progress on those, we have 6 years left to achieve them. We know we won't do that for the Sustainable Development Goal on gender equality. But young people play such a key role in having very bravely and courageously conversations about power dynamics, about calling out stereotypes where they exist. I think it's really small actions by young people that can have that ripple effect. And we saw this recently during the 16 Days campaign against gender-based violence, which UN Women and so many others supported. We worked with a group of young activists. And I'll give one example. We worked in many communities to support them, but in Zenica, for example, this young group of girls and boys had this initiative. They came up with this brilliant idea to hand out flowers to boys on the street. And we know that there are so many gender stereotypes here, but around the world. And for men even to take the rose, it was an issue. And when the young people, the idea behind the rose was, and there was a number on the rose for the hotline to call in cases of violence or gender-based violence. So they gave the rose to people, especially to women, but to tell them, or they gave the rose to men, telling them to share it with a woman that needs to potentially use the hotline or needs support. And that initiative had such a ripple effect. It had such a conversation in the community. And those individuals that chose this action went home and discussed it with their families. Those families had broader discussions in the community. Anyone in a position of influence can also make a difference. So it's really important to work with those influencers that have the audience, that are being listened to. But young people are part of that conversation, especially through engagement on social media right now. Social media can be such a tool for positive change. We know social media contributes to online harassment and abuse, but it can really be turned around to tackle some of these issues around patriarchy, stereotypes, toxic masculinities, if it's used in the right way. But young people are truly the hope for the future.
Sexual and gender-based violence is a major issue worldwide. What are the most urgent challenges today?
Yes, let me just share a couple of data points just to speak to that point, to show, I mean, it is a challenge, but it's an epidemic, and it's the gravest violation of human rights we see worldwide. 136 women killed every day. Every 11 minutes, a woman is killed by her intimate partner or loved one. We know the statistics worldwide, 1 in 3 women are experiencing different forms of violence. So the question is, what drives it? What is behind the violence? We also know very often that when violence happens, women are blamed, or the conversation becomes about women, rather than, what are the root causes when we look at what is causing violence to occur in the first place. There's many different aspects when we talk about it. It's a very complex social phenomenon, and it's so much more than about the individual. It's about societies. So when we look at what needs to be tackled to really address violence, it's really, yes, laws, strengthening legislation, aligning now with the gold bar standards of the Istanbul Convention is key. But even more important than that, you can have the best laws in place, but if you don't have the capacities of prosecutors, of law enforcement, if you don't have financed centers for social welfare or safe houses, or you don't have enough beds in safe houses for women to go to when they experience violence, or economic empowerment programs, if you don't have women active in the labor force, which is also a serious challenge in many countries and economies, including here, women won't be able to leave abusive relationships. You also need to ensure that social norms which drive violence, as we all know very well, if we look at issues around patriarchy, unequal power dynamics, ideas that men have to be strong, and the notion that men need to exert their strength to show their power, these very notions need to be challenged and addressed at an early age in a very systematic way, through educational systems, through conversations, youth engagement, supporting different advocacy initiatives. So it really requires a comprehensive approach, and you can't address violence in isolation. You also have to ensure that responses are coordinated, that they're multi-sectoral, that ministries of health, ministries of education, justice, social work, they're all actively involved in addressing the challenge.
What are the biggest barriers globally and in Bosnia to combating gender-based violence?
I think one of the greatest barriers is still awareness, understanding for especially victims to understand when it happens to them, to define it. We all, when we look back at our lives, and especially when I look back at when I was younger, certain things happen, or we hear about things happening to friends, to family, and we don't fully understand what it means. We don't understand necessarily that something is specifically violence, why it's violence, what are the solutions, what are the options to address it. So more information needs to be increased to ensure that it's reported, that it's understood, that there's awareness about it. The other challenge we're seeing right now is different forms of violence increasing. So technology-facilitated violence, online violence. The numbers are really shocking. More than 60% of young girls are reporting online violence, harassment, bullying. And we also know that violence is also manifesting through political participation. We know, for example, here in Bosnia and Herzegovina, that 60% of women who have run as candidates have also reported that they've experienced some form of violence. So really looking at the new forms of violence, looking beyond what we understand to be traditional notions of violence, and making sure that those different manifestations are really reflected in new laws that are being developed and strengthened, and also that there's capacities by police, prosecutors, judges to really understand these different aspects of violence and to be part of responding effectively. The other issue is access to justice and ensuring that there is no tolerance for justice, but also when violence happens, that perpetrators are penalized, that they are sentenced effectively, because we all know what very often happens. There is a light and lenient sentence, and that does very little to deter violence from happening. So really looking at the sanctions around violence, but also the protections as well. Making sure that safe houses are financed, that they have the support they need to operate effectively. They shouldn't have to depend only on support from the international community. They shouldn't have to wait for the next installment of funding to come from municipalities or from the government. They need to really have the constant funding support, not only to run safe houses, but also to run services for survivors. And we see many examples of this being strengthened and improved, especially here in Bosnia and Herzegovina. But it's a fundamental challenge, not only having good laws, but making sure that they're enforced and financed. Because also you have many institutions responsible for enforcing laws. But if there's limited budget for trainings, for building capacity, for running the right programs, we also won't see an effective response to ending violence against women and girls.
UN Women is supporting Bosnia and Herzegovina in implementing the Istanbul Convention. What progress has been made and what are the next steps?
There has been some very important progress made. The Istanbul Convention is really the highest standard in terms of addressing violence against women and girls. So it sets standards that are, seen as really the gold bar for all countries to strive towards. All countries are working on this agenda of fully implementing the protections and the requirements of the Istanbul Convention. But for Bosnia and Herzegovina, important progress has been made. There's been a number of steps to strengthen legislation. So what we see, for example, I'll give one example in the Republic of Srpska, there have been efforts made to address issues around sexual harassment, sexual violence in the legislation. In the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina also, there is a new law that is now being discussed and hopefully will soon be adopted that is also improving the alignment of the current legislation with the standards of the Istanbul Convention. But there are still a number of gaps. Some of these, we hope, will be addressed in the law, but then they also need to be implemented. One requirement that was reported on by the Grevio Committee, which assessed Bosnia-Herzegovina's implementation of the Istanbul Convention, was regarding risk assessments. And this is a really key area, to have proper risk assessments to ensure that perpetrators are prevented from committing crimes, that the system is involved in committing violence, that the system is analyzing data in the right way, is undertaking the right measures to prevent crimes from happening from perpetrators. So that whole system-wide risk assessment process needs to be strengthened. It needs to be required in the law. The other area is prevention, because very often we focus only on protection of victims of violence. And prevention needs, it's a very critical part of the Istanbul Convention. What we have seen here and in many countries around the world are very ad hoc measures around prevention. So we often see civil society organizations leading a number of measures, some efforts in schools that are maybe not as systematically required through the curriculum, coordinated through the government. And what we really need is a more systematic approach by all different actors involved to really look systematically at preventing violence from happening in the first place. Also working with perpetrators through perpetrator programs, which is very difficult to do, but it's something that is very important according to the Istanbul Convention. So there's a number of gaps and measures, but financing laws, enforcing laws, we're on a very good path here to see laws strengthened. There still are questions, of course, around including definitions of femicide in legislation. This has been heavily discussed in Bosnia and Herzegovina. It's discussed in many countries around the world. There's a very limited number of countries that actually include a definition. But of course, this is the aspiration of the Istanbul Convention to really have this comprehensive definition included. Sometimes progress needs to be made incrementally. But we hope that over time, all of these standards will be put in place. Civil society plays a key role in also monitoring the implementation of the Istanbul Convention. So their efforts in advocating for changes, in also supporting strengthening of laws, is really critical in ensuring that the convention is fully implemented.
What do you hope the world will look like for your children in 10 or 20 years?
I think hope is the key word here. I hope the world will be a place where we see women and men and girls and boys able to realize their full potential, where someone's gender is not a barrier to hold them back from attaining their full potential. I hope that some of the power dynamics that we see played out in politics, in the household, will be tackled effectively, that gender norms will be questioned more broadly in society, that women running in politics will not be subjected to violence, that the number will go up worldwide. We're far from the 50% target of equal participation of women and men in decision-making. So I hope we will see that number get closer to the 50% mark. I hope that girls and boys will not feel limited in their dreams and aspirations by norms that lead them to believe that they are not able to pursue certain fields of study or careers, so that those questions are no longer a barrier for them in pursuing what it is they want to become in their lives. And also that in every household, we see women and men equally sharing care responsibilities, housework, care for parents, that these issues are not solely on the shoulders of women, that we see that equality in households, which will translate into broader equality in society as well. So many lofty goals as well. And in terms of violence against women and girls, I hope that every woman will be able to recognize violence when it happens, to report it, to have the safety, the protections in place, to have places where she can fully be supported when violence happens, but also to have the economic means to walk away from an abusive relationship to prevent violence from happening in the first place. And I hope that men and boys will be at the forefront of conversations about gender equality. Because when we talk about violence against women and girls, really, it depends so much on the full engagement and participation of men in this conversation. So I hope that men will actively be involved in talking about the importance of gender equality in their communities and also globally.
And what is the key messages you would like to leave for our listeners?
The key message is every individual can make a significant difference. And we talked about this a lot during the 16 days campaign against gender-based violence. Whether it's reading a book with your kids and calling out stereotypes you see in a book, because we know that children's books are full of stereotypes. Having these basic conversations at an early age within the home, talking about them, trying to prevent them from happening, and building that understanding as well, that critical thinking about patriarchy, about inequalities, working towards a notion of realizing full shared power. Also, I think the other thing that individuals can do is have conversations in their community, initiate different actions. It can be small, it can be big. It can be speaking to someone we know that's in a position of power, a mayor or someone that is a municipal councillor, about suggested changes to a law, or lighting in a community to make boys and girls feel safer when they're walking late at night. It can also be advocating for legislative changes or supporting the financing of organizations that advocate for zero violence. So there's all sorts of initiatives. The media plays a huge role as well. And we've seen a lot of critical pieces lately talking about the important role that media play. And in reporting on violence in the right way, because we know sometimes that reporting can also be harmful in how violence is portrayed, or where we see instances of victim blaming as well. We know media can very much be part of the solution. So podcasts like this can make a big difference because they're raising awareness and they're initiating conversations. I hope that our viewers today, after listening to this podcast, will take the conversation further in their families, in their schools, with their peers, to really talk about some of the issues that are being addressed through this podcast. So I really want to thank you, Nikola, and the Foundation for Local Democracy in initiating this really important podcast, and I hope it raises awareness greatly in society.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Joan Bishop, predstavnica kancelarije UN Women u Bosni i Hercegovini, bila je gošća podcasta. Hvala za pažnju i doviđenja.